"I'm sorry, but we can't just hand out cash to anyone who walks in here," Stephen Powell, the main branch manager of Summit Legacy Bank in Atlanta, Georgia, said, his tone smooth but dripping with contempt. He slid the withdrawal slip across the marble counter, his sharp, cold eyes scanning the black man standing opposite him. "Especially not for an amount this large." His words echoed through the Grand Bank lobby, like a proclamation, causing nearby employees to pause and turn their heads. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. That man was Walter Thompson, 75, dressed in a worn fabric jacket frayed at the shoulders, faded khakis, and a baseball cap shielding his silver hair. No one in the branch knew he was the founder of Summit Legacy Bank, the one who'd turned it from a small operation into a financial empire. Walter stood there, requesting to withdraw $300,000 for a community education center project. But deep down, he wanted to test whether his bank still honored its promise to serve everyone fairly. Across from him stood Laura Bennett, a young teller with blonde hair tied high, and a forced smile. When Walter handed over his bank card and ID, requesting the withdrawal, Laura frowned, holding the card with suspicion. "This amount, it's huge," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation, her eyes flicking over Walter's attire as if sizing him up. Without waiting for a reply, she leaned over and whispered to Ethan Clark, a teller at the next station. "This guy wants to withdraw $300,000. Looking like that, how could he have money?" Ethan glanced at Walter, his lips curling into a mocking smirk. "You kidding? He probably wandered into the wrong bank," he muttered, loud enough for Walter to hear. Snickers spread among the nearby staff. Hannah Reed, another teller, covered her mouth, but her eyes gleamed with disdain as they fixed on Walter's old baseball cap. "You mean he might have $300, tops," she whispered to Ethan, her voice just loud enough to carry across the counter. A few customers in the lobby took notice, their curious gazes settling on Walter. A white man, Mr. Larson, standing at the next counter, shook his head in irritation. "What a disgrace, coming to a bank and pulling this kind of stunt," he said loudly, as if wanting the whole lobby to hear. The elegant bank lobby surrounded Walter, gleaming marble floors, ceiling lights illuminating every corner, and the steady hum of money-counting machines. On the wall, a large plaque bore the words, "Summit Legacy Bank, serving every customer with fairness and respect." But those words now rang hollow. Walter stood tall, his eyes locked on Stephen, his hand resting lightly on the counter. He felt the humiliation, a sensation he'd faced his whole life, from his days as a bank security guard decades ago. Yet he didn't react, silently noting Laura's skeptical glance, Ethan's mocking grin, and Hannah's complicit silence. Stephen crossed his arms, the smile on his face stiffening. "Do you get it?" he said, his voice rising, drawing more eyes from the surrounding customers. "A sum this big requires thorough verification. We can't take risks." He tilted his head, eyeing Walter from head to toe, as if underscoring his unworthiness. "Maybe you should try the check cashing place nearby. They're more used to people like you." An elderly woman seated in the corner shook her head, her sympathetic eyes fixed on Walter, as if she'd seen this scene before. But Walter remained steadfast, his dignity unshaken, even as the insults grew heavier with each passing second. These employees had no idea they were about to face a truth that would change everything. The truth about the man they were belittling, about their careers, about this bank, forever. The brief silence, after Stephen Powell's words, hung like a cold gust through the bank lobby. Walter Thompson stood there, his gaze unwavering on the branch manager, his hand still resting lightly on the marble counter. Stephen's suggestion to try the check cashing place wasn't just a transaction denial, it was a slap to his dignity, a biting insinuation about his race and age. But Walter didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, his sharp eyes sweeping over Laura Bennett, Ethan Clark, and Hannah Reed, who stood in a line behind the counter, like an invisible wall confronting him. Laura bowed her head, her eyes darting to the papers on her desk, as if avoiding Walter's stare. But Ethan didn't hold back. He crossed his arms, that mocking grin still lingering. Bet he just won the lottery, or something, huh? He said loudly, his tone dripping with sarcasm, making Hannah laugh out loud. She covered her mouth, but her eyes sparkled with amusement as she looked at Walter, as if he were a living joke. Or he got the wrong account, Hannah added, her voice falsely sweet. A sum that big, he should probably double-check. Their laughter rang out, small but sharp, like needles piercing the air. Customers in the lobby began turning, some whispering, others showing annoyance. Mr. Larson, the white man who'd spoken earlier, stepped closer to the counter, his crisp gray suit exuding confidence. Listen, buddy, he said, his tone lecturing. We're here for serious business, not to watch you make a scene. If you don't have the money, stop wasting everyone's time. His words poured fuel on the fire, making Ethan and Hannah laugh harder, while Laura bit her lip, her eyes flicking to Walter with a hint of guilt. But Walter stood still, his dignity unshaken. He felt every gaze in the lobby, the curiosity, the doubt, and the rare empathy from an elderly black woman in the corner, her hands clutching her purse, as if holding something back. He knew this scene wasn't new. It reminded him of his youth, standing before another bank counter, denied service for his skin color, labeled as someone who didn't belong. But now, he wasn't that 25-year-old anymore. He was the founder of Summit Legacy Bank, and he wouldn't let this insult slide. I just want to withdraw money from my account, Walter said, his voice low and clear, without a tremor. I've provided all the paperwork. If there's an issue, I'd like to speak to someone with more authority. His request was simple, reasonable, but it hit Stephen like a challenge. The manager raised an eyebrow, his smile twisting, as if offended by Walter's resolve. More authority, Stephen repeated, his voice rising, almost mocking. He stepped closer to the counter, arms crossed, eyes raking Walter from head to toe. I'm the highest authority here, buddy, and I'm saying this transaction can't happen. He leaned in, lowering his voice, but still audible to all, like an actor on stage. Maybe you should hit up that check-cashing spot a few blocks away. They're more familiar with your kind of transactions. That word, kind laced with emphasis, was a razor-sharp jab, unmasking his prejudice about Walter's race and age. Ethan burst out laughing, no longer hiding it. He probably thinks he's some big shot, he said, turning to Hannah, who nodded eagerly. Right, maybe he just found someone's lost wallet, she replied, her voice sweet but venomous. Laura, the only one showing guilt, bowed her head lower, flipping through unnecessary papers as if escaping the scene. But her silence was complicity too. Customers in the lobby stopped pretending to mind their own business. A young woman at the next counter pulled out her phone, discreetly filming. A middle-aged white man whispered to his wife, loud enough to hear, probably another scam. But the elderly black woman in the corner kept watching Walter, her eyes saying she understood, that she'd been in his shoes. Walter took a deep breath, his hand tightening slightly, on the counter. He felt the humiliation, but it didn't break him. Instead, it stoked a smoldering fire, not anger, but resolve. He knew he stood for something bigger, not just himself, but everyone dismissed for their looks or skin. He quietly pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, fingers moving slowly but surely. The action made Ethan and Hannah stop laughing, their eyes darting to each other, with a flicker of doubt. But Stephen just smirked, as if it were a joke. What's this? Calling a lawyer, Stephen said, his tone thick with sarcasm. He crossed his arms, standing tall, as if asserting absolute control over the branch. Leave before I have to call security. We don't have time for this. The air in the main branch lobby grew heavy, like a storm brewing. Walter Thompson stood before the counter, his gaze locked on Stephen Powell, the manager who'd just told him to leave. Ethan Clark and Hannah Reed's mocking laughter still echoed in his ears, blending with Stephen's contemptuous words. Maybe you should hit up that check-cashing spot a few blocks away. They're more familiar with your kind of people. It wasn't just a refusal, It was a sharp blade, slicing into his dignity, dredging up memories Walter thought he'd buried long ago. He stood there, hand gripping the phone in his worn jacket pocket, his eyes steady. On the outside, he was a 75-year-old black man in a frayed coat and baseball cap, but inside, he was the founder of Summit Legacy Bank, who'd built it from a tiny office with a handful of staff. This insult, from the very bank he'd poured his sweat and soul into, unleashed a torrent of vivid memories, pulling him back to his hardest years. Over 50 years ago, Walter was a 23-year-old security guard at a small Atlanta bank, the precursor to Summit Legacy. He wore a dark blue uniform, stationed in the lobby's corner, called boy by white coworkers, despite being grown. Every day, he saw black customers treated worse, asked for extra paperwork, denied loans, or met with suspicious stares, but Walter refused to let that injustice define him. At night, after everyone left, he stayed behind, secretly reading discarded financial documents, learning about interest rates, credit, and bank management from crumpled scraps. A sharp memory flashed at 27, standing before another bank's counter, applying for a loan to buy his first home. He'd brought all the paperwork, had a steady job, but the teller, a middle-aged white man, glanced at his file and shoved it back. "Your application isn't convincing enough," he'd said, his eyes barely hiding contempt. "Maybe try somewhere else." Walter knew it wasn't the file, it was his skin. That night, in his small apartment, he looked at his wife and vowed that one day, he'd create a bank where everyone was treated fairly, no matter who they were. That memory drove him relentlessly forward. From his earliest days in banking, Walter faced skeptical looks, not for his skill, but for prejudice. "You sure you understand these numbers?" a manager once asked, half mocking, half doubting. But Walter didn't just understand, he mastered them with precision, agility, and a financial instinct that outshone others. He didn't prove it with words, but with action. Walter quickly became the branch's top performer, handling hundreds of transactions weekly with accuracy and care, earning customers' total trust. Soon, his talent forced recognition. From teller, he rose to branch manager, then regional manager. He revived struggling branches with bold, effective strategies, solutions no one expected, but which delivered clear results. Walter wasn't just good with numbers, he saw the people behind them, and that made the difference. Walter stood before Summit Legacy Bank's board, by then a major respected player in the market. He was nominated for CEO, a deserved leap after years of dedication, but not everyone approved. In closed meetings, some whispered, "He's good, no doubt, but will big clients feel comfortable with someone like him in charge?" Walter overheard those words. He didn't need to catch every syllable to grasp their meaning. Instead of letting doubt block him, he turned it into fuel. With solid backing from those who saw his true ability, Walter became CEO, and from there, he proved the choice right. Under his leadership, the bank hit record revenues, expanded by dozens of branches, and most crucially, built a reputation for transparency and fairness in customer service. Values Walter always held as core. Those memories raced through Walter's mind in seconds, a powerful river dragging him back to the present. He looked at Stephen, who'd just called him a kind of person who didn't belong. He looked at Ethan and Hannah, giggling as if he were a punchline. He looked at Laura, the only one showing remorse but staying silent, and he looked at the wall plaque, bearing the promise he'd penned when founding this bank, serving every customer with fairness and respect. The bitter truth hit him. His bank had veered off course. The values he'd spent a lifetime building, respect, fairness, dignity, were being trampled in this very lobby, by people he'd given a chance. But Walter didn't feel despair. Instead, a smoldering fire flared, not anger, but resolve. He wasn't here just for himself, but for every customer ever dismissed, pushed out these doors for their race, age, or appearance. He quietly pulled the phone from his jacket pocket, fingers moving slowly but surely. The action stopped Hannah's laughter, her eyes flicking to Ethan with a hint of doubt. Stephen smirked, as if it were a pointless jest. "What's this? Calling someone to save you," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm, arms crossed to assert his total dominance. But Walter didn't answer. He just stared at Stephen, his gaze piercing, as if already seeing the manager's fate. The bank lobby, with its blazing lights and steady hum of money counters, suddenly felt more stifling than ever. Every eye turned to Walter, from curious customers to mocking staff, but he stood unmoved, like a mountain against the wind. He knew what was coming, and he was ready to change everything, not just for today, but for Summit Legacy Bank's future. Walter Thompson stood before the counter, his eyes still locked on Stephen Powell, the manager who'd mocked him with a taunt to call someone to save him. Ethan Clark and Hannah Reed's snickers hung in the air, but Walter let them not sway his resolve. His hand gripped the phone in his old jacket pocket, but he didn't rush to dial. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze sweeping the expansive lobby of Summit Legacy Bank in Atlanta, Georgia. He wanted a clearer view, not just of the insult aimed at him, but of how this branch treated others. The lobby gleamed under ceiling lights, marble floors reflecting every passing figure, the hum of money counters mixed with keyboard clacks and staff voices. On the wall, the large plaque still proclaimed, serving every customer with fairness and respect. But to Walter, it now mocked him, a promise betrayed. He sat in a waiting area chair, pretending to check his phone, but really, he observed every move in the branch, every glance, word and gesture from the staff. First, he noticed a white man, about 40, in a neat gray suit, approach Ethan's counter. He requested a $50,000 withdrawal, and Ethan flashed a broad smile. "No problem, sir," he said, voice honeyed, fingers swiftly tapping the keyboard. Within minutes, the transaction was done, Ethan even slipping him a business card, inviting him back anytime. Walter noted, no extra paperwork, no unnecessary questions, just friendliness and efficiency. Soon after, a black woman, around 30, in a simple coat, stepped to Hannah's counter. She asked to check her account for a transfer to fund her kids' schooling. Hannah frowned, her eyes scanning her as if judging. "Hold on, the system's slow," she said coolly, though Walter saw she hadn't even checked the computer. The woman waited over 10 minutes, eyes uneasy, while Hannah chatted with Laura Bennett about something personal. Finally, Hannah processed it reluctantly, offering no smile or explanation. Walter clenched his fist, a surge of injustice rising within. He kept watching. An Asian young man in a hoodie approached Laura's counter to open a savings account. Laura demanded 2 IDs, then quizzed him on the money's source. Questions Walter knew weren't standard. "We need to be sure, you understand," she said stiffly. The young man fumbled, explaining, but Laura just nodded curtly, making him wait another 10 minutes. Meanwhile, a white customer in a plain shirt opened an account at the next counter with 1 ID, done in under 5 minutes. The pattern of unfairness unfolded before Walter like a painting drawn with cruel strokes. Customers of color, or those looking less polished, got worse treatment, longer waits, more questions, more suspicious stares. He recalled internal reports he'd read before retiring, stats showing service disparities across racial groups. The board had dismissed them as statistical noise, but now, in his own bank's lobby, Walter saw it wasn't noise. It was a deep-rooted culture of discrimination, right under his nose. He glanced at the wall plaque again, the fairness and respect promise he'd crafted when founding Summit Legacy Bank. That vow had once been his guiding flame, from his days as a scorned guard, to his rise as CEO, determined to build a bank where everyone was equal. But now, that flame was being snuffed out by people like Stephen, Ethan, Hannah, and even Laura, silent amid injustice. Walter took a deep breath, his hand easing off the phone in his pocket. He wasn't here just for $300,000 or personal insult. He was here for the black woman made to wait needlessly, the Asian youth asked pointless questions, the elderly black woman in the corner with empathetic eyes, and every customer who'd walked through these doors hoping for dignity. He knew he had to act, not just to fix today, but to restore what Summit Legacy Bank once stood for. Walter Thompson pulled the old phone from his frayed jacket pocket, fingers moving slowly but surely across the screen. Stephen Powell, the branch manager, stood behind the counter, arms crossed, a smug grin lingering after mocking Walter. Ethan Clark and Hannah Reed whispered to each other, eyes flicking to him with amusement, as if he were a joke nearing its punchline. Laura Bennett bowed her head, flipping through papers, her guilty eyes silent. Walter hit call, raising the phone to his ear, his voice low and clear. "Evelyn, I need you at the main branch, right now." The lobby fell into an oddly still moment. Ethan stopped laughing, his eyes darting to Hannah, with a flicker of doubt. "What'd he say?" Hannah whispered, voice hushed, as if disbelieving her ears. Stephen smirked, stepping closer to the counter, his tone dripping sarcasm. "Calling someone to rescue you, or a lawyer to sue us." He chuckled, arms crossed, asserting his absolute control. "Go on, buddy, before I have security escort you out." But Walter didn't reply. He just stared at Stephen, his gaze piercing, as if foreseeing the manager's end. He stood, walking closer to the counter, his old jacket swaying with each step. The money counters hummed on, but the lobby air grew thick, as if everyone held their breath. Customers, from the young woman filming on her phone, to the elderly black woman in the corner, to Mr. Larson with his annoyed scowl, all turned to Walter, curiosity mingling with suspicion. Less than 7 minutes later, the main branch doors swung open. Evelyn Carter, Summit Legacy Bank's current CEO, strode in, her black suit sharp, her eyes stern. With her were 2 board members, Leonard Hayes and Grace Newen, both radiating authority. Stephen froze, his grin vanishing. Ethan and Hannah stopped whispering, their eyes widening, as if sensing something dire. Laura looked up, her hands trembling as she spotted Evelyn. Evelyn marched to the counter, her gaze sweeping Stephen, Ethan, Hannah, then resting on Walter. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice low but resonant, "I'm sorry you were kept waiting." She turned to Stephen, eyes icy. "Do you know who you just denied a transaction?" Stephen paled, his lips moving but no words coming out. Evelyn didn't wait for an answer. She faced the lobby, her voice clear, loud enough for all to hear. "This is Walter Thompson, founder of Summit Legacy Bank, former CEO, and the man who made this bank a financial icon. He doesn't just have the right to withdraw $300,000, he has the right to decide everything here." The lobby erupted in stunned whispers. Ethan covered his mouth, eyes panicked as he looked at Hannah, who burst into tears, mascara streaking her cheeks. Laura shook, dropping her papers, head bowed, as if wanting to sink through the floor. Stephen stepped back, fists clenched, his arrogance replaced by raw fear. Customers gaped. The young woman filmed faster. Mr. Larson's jaw dropped, and the elderly black woman smiled, her eyes gleaming as if justice had arrived. Evelyn raised a hand, signaling Michael Tran, a security guard, to step forward with a small projector. She ordered the security footage displayed on a white wall near the counter. The images were stark. Stephen denying Walter, Ethan and Hannah mocking him, Laura silently complicit. Then came clips of the black woman, forced to wait unjustly, the Asian youth grilled unnecessarily, all undeniable, recorded proof. "Is this how this branch operates?" Evelyn asked, her voice cutting like a blade. "Under your management, Stephen." Stephen stammered, grasping for excuses. I was just following security policy. I didn't know." But his voice was feeble, convincing no one. Leonard Hayes, a board member, shook his head. "Security policy doesn't include insulting customers or discriminating by race," he said, his stern eyes on Stephen. Walter stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "I built this bank to serve people, not humiliate them," he said, his gaze sweeping Stephen, Ethan, Hannah, and Laura. "You didn't just deny me. You denied every customer treated unfairly here." His words landed like a hammer, silencing the lobby. The elderly black woman in the corner nodded, her eyes shining with pride. Evelyn turned to Walter, dipping her head slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry this happened. How do you want to handle it?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He looked at Stephen, Ethan, Hannah, and Laura, his eyes not angry, but deeply disappointed. He knew what had to be done, and he'd do it now, in front of everyone. The main branch lobby of Summit Legacy Bank in Atlanta, Georgia, sank into heavy silence after Walter Thompson's words. "I built this bank to serve people, not humiliate them," he said, his voice low but resounding, like a verdict. His eyes swept over Stephen Powell, Ethan Clark, Hannah Reed, and Laura Bennett, the ones who'd mocked him, denied him, and shattered the core values he'd spent a lifetime building. Evelyn Carter, the CEO, stood beside him, her gaze stern, awaiting Walter's decision. Stephen stepped back, hands trembling slightly, trying to stay composed, but unable to hide the panic in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice weak, like someone who'd crossed a line too far. Ethan covered his mouth, eyes frantic as he glanced at Hannah, who sobbed, tears streaming down her face, hands shaking as she clutched her cheeks. Laura kept her head down, papers scattering from her desk to the floor, as if she wanted to vanish. But Walter didn't waver. He stepped closer to the counter, his gaze sharp yet calm, like a leader seasoned in tough calls. "Stephen Powell," Walter said, his voice clear, unwavering, "you're fired, effective immediately." His declaration struck like a gavel, freezing Stephen, his face draining of color. "Ethan Clark, Hannah Reed," he continued, eyes shifting to the two tellers, "you too. Discriminatory behavior and customer insults have no place in this bank." Ethan's jaw dropped, as if to protest, but Walter's stern look silenced him. Hannah cried harder, choking out, "I'm sorry, I didn't know," but her apology came too late. Customers in the lobby, from the young woman filming, to Mr. Larson stunned silent, to the elderly black woman in the corner, watched in hush, eyes fixed on Walter. The security footage still played on the wall, looping Stephen's denial, Ethan and Hannah's taunts, an irrefutable testament. Evelyn nodded to Michael Tran, the branch guard, signaling him to prepare to escort the three out. Stephen clenched his fists, his eyes darting to Evelyn for rescue, but she met him with an icy stare. "Mr. Thompson's decision is final," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. But Walter wasn't done. He turned to Laura, the only one who'd shown remorse from the start. She looked up, eyes red, hands trembling as they gripped the counter's edge. "Laura Bennett," he said, his tone softer, but still firm, "you stayed silent when you should have spoken up, but I see regret in your eyes." Laura bowed her head, tears splashing onto the desk. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know what to do," she whispered, voice breaking. Walter nodded slightly. "You won't be fired, but you must learn from this. Next time, stand for what's right, no matter how hard." Laura nodded rapidly, tears still falling, but her eyes lit with gratitude. Walter turned to the lobby, stepping into the crowd, his gaze sweeping staff and customers. "I want everyone here to hear this," he said, his voice rising like an unforgettable speech. "Over 50 years ago, I stood before another bank counter, denied service just for my skin color. I swore one day I'd create a place where everyone's treated with dignity, no matter who they are. That's why Summit Legacy Bank exists." He paused, his eyes resting on the wall plaque, serving every customer with fairness and respect. "But today, I saw the opposite," he went on, his voice dropping, heavy with disappointment. "You didn't just insult me, you insulted every customer treated unfairly here. That ends now." The lobby fell dead silent, only the breaths of onlookers audible. The elderly black woman in the corner smiled, her eyes glowing with pride. The young woman with the phone nodded, as if absorbing a vital lesson. Even Mr. Larson, who'd mocked Walter, bowed his head, a flicker of shame in his eyes. Walter turned to Evelyn. "I want you to audit this branch's entire data," he said, his voice firm. "Review security footage, transaction records, everything. I want to know how many customers have been treated like me today." Evelyn nodded instantly. "I'll start right away, Mr. Thompson," she replied, her eyes blazing with resolve. and I suggest closing this branch for the day, for an emergency staff meeting." Walter nodded approval. He glanced at Stephen, Ethan, and Hannah one last time as Michael Tran stepped up, motioning them to gather their things and leave. Stephen turned away silently, shoulders slumped like a defeated man. Ethan and Hannah followed, their eyes blank, as if losing everything in an instant. Laura stayed behind the counter, her gaze on Walter now filled with fresh respect. Walter stood in the lobby's center, eyes sweeping the space he'd built from its earliest days. He knew firing them was just the start. A lesson was taught today, but real change needed more, and he'd make it happen, starting now. A week after the seismic event at Summit Legacy Bank's main branch in Atlanta, Georgia, Walter Thompson stood at a podium in the Crown Plaza Hotel's elegant conference room. He still wore his frayed jacket, but his eyes radiated unshakable authority and resolve. Before him sat dozens of reporters, bank staff and guests, all silent in anticipation. Behind him stood Evelyn Carter, the CEO, with board members Leonard Hayes and Grace Nguyen, their gazes reflecting respect for the bank's founder. Walter cleared his throat, his low, clear voice ringing through the mic. "Today, I stand here not as a customer denied a withdrawal," he began, eyes scanning the crowd. "I stand as Summit Legacy Bank's founder, who's seen this bank stray from the values it was built on: fairness, respect, and dignity for all." The room hushed, only camera clicks and reporters' pens breaking the silence. "Last week, I saw a painful truth," he continued. "Not only was I insulted, but hundreds of others, treated unfairly for their race, age, or appearance. That's unacceptable." He paused, his gaze resting on Evelyn, who nodded faintly in commitment. "So, I'm announcing the Thompson Fairness Initiative, a $15 million program to transform Summit Legacy Bank from the inside out." Applause erupted, but Walter raised a hand for quiet. "This money will retrain all staff on anti-discrimination, fund small businesses in communities of color, and improve customer service so no one's left behind," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll audit every branch, review every transaction, and ensure our plaques promise, serving every customer with fairness and respect, isn't just empty words." Evelyn stepped forward, eyes alight with determination. "We've started reviewing data from the main branch," she said, voice clear. "Over 200 discrimination cases were identified this past year, from baseless loan denials to unnecessary transaction delays. That stops now." She turned to Walter, dipping her head. "Mr. Thompson's shown the way, and will follow through." Among the guests, 3 stepped to the podium. James Carter, a black entrepreneur, denied a loan, despite a perfect record. Maria Lopez, a single mom, treated coldly when depositing money. And Kevin Park, an Asian youth, asked for unneeded paperwork to open an account. Walter shook each hand, his eyes warm, yet firm. "They'll join our new customer advisory board," he said, his voice a pledge. "Their voices will help us right wrongs, and ensure no one endures what they did." Applause roared again, louder, longer. Reporters scribbled fast, flashes popping. Walter stepped back, letting Evelyn field questions, but his eyes still scanned the crowd, seeking something deeper. He knew $15 million couldn't erase bias entirely, but it was a start, a declaration that Summit Legacy Bank wouldn't tolerate injustice. At the main branch, things had shifted too. Laura Bennett, whom Walter gave a chance to redeem, was named interim manager after Stephen, Ethan, and Hannah's firings. She stood behind the counter, eyes bright with new resolve, directing staff to handle transactions with respect for all. A new team, trained under Evelyn's anti-discrimination program, began work committed to restoring the branch's reputation. 3 months after the Crown Plaza press conference, Walter Thompson walked into Summit Legacy Bank's main branch in Atlanta, Georgia. He still wore his frayed jacket, faded khakis, and baseball cap over silver hair, just as he had when denied his $300,000 withdrawal. But this time the lobby felt different. Money counters hummed, marble floors gleamed under ceiling lights, but the staff's eyes no longer carried suspicion or scorn. Instead, They greeted every customer with genuine smiles, from a white man in a suit, to a black mom with a stroller, to an Asian youth with a backpack. Walter stood in the corner, his gaze settling on the counter, where Laura Bennett, now interim manager, guided a new teller. "Remember, we're here to help, not judge," Laura said, her voice gentle but firm. A black woman approached, asking to check her account, and Laura handled it swiftly, chatting with the respect Walter had once dreamed of for his bank. He nodded slightly, a faint smile crossing his lips. Laura had learned the lesson he'd hoped, not just correcting her mistake, but spreading change. He looked up at the wall plaque, serving every customer with fairness and respect. For the first time in years, it didn't feel hollow. The Thompson Fairness Initiative was bearing fruit, over 500 staff retrained, dozens of small businesses in communities of color funded, and branches across Atlanta, reporting clear service improvements. But Walter knew real change took time. This was just the start, and he'd keep watch, a silent guardian of the values he'd set. That afternoon, Walter sat on a wooden bench in a small park near his suburban Atlanta home, beside his 12-year-old granddaughter, Mia, her bright eyes and radiant smile lighting up the moment. "Grandpa, did you really fire them right there in the bank?" Mia asked, voice curious, holding a melting ice cream cone. Walter chuckled, nodding. "Yes, Mia, but not because I was mad. I did it so they'd learn no one gets to look down on anyone." Mia tilted her head, eyes sparkling. "But how'd you stand it when they said such awful things?" Walter gazed into the distance, at trees swaying in the breeze. "I've heard worse since I was young, Mia. But each time I told myself, don't get angry, change it, and I did, step by step." He patted her shoulder, his voice softening. "That day wasn't just about me. It was about everyone treated unfairly, like our folks, like your friends. I wanted them to know respect isn't something you beg for, it's what they deserve." Mia nodded, as if grasping something big, and Walter smiled, feeling a piece of his hope passed to the next generation. The story of Walter Thompson in Black Old Man, denied withdrawal service at his own bank. 7 minutes later, he fired the manager on spot, reflects a reality still present in today's U.S. Discrimination by race and age, subtle or overt, still seeps into institutions and daily life. At Summit Legacy Bank's Atlanta branch, Walter, a 75-year-old black man, was denied a withdrawal for his simple appearance and skin color, with Stephen Powell and staff like Ethan and Hannah mocking him with lines like, "Maybe you should try the check cashing place," or "Does he even have $300? This echoes recent U.S. studies showing people of color often face unfair delays or denials in financial services compared to whites. Walter's journey, from a scorned security guard to bank founder, mirrors real stories of African Americans, like Robert F. Smith, rising past bias to succeed, yet still confronting injustice. The lesson here for today's U.S. is everyone must actively face and fix unfairness, no matter their role, rather than silently accepting it. Walter didn't just fire Stephen. He launched the $15 million Thompson Fairness Initiative to retrain staff and support communities of color, showing system change starts with personal action. You, whether a worker like Laura learning to speak up, or a leader like Evelyn driving reform, can make a difference. Don't wait for others. Stand up like Walter, using your own experiences, like his loan denial at 27, to fight for the respect every American, regardless of race or age, deserves in today's diverse society. If you believe in justice and want more stories like Walter Thompson's journey, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for joining us. See you soon to keep spreading the message of fairness and respect.